And I'll pass it off to Ed Taylor.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. Meeting you in the first 2 months of landing in Nipper Valley was truly, truly a blessing. And now I have the high honor of introducing our panelists. First, we have Amir Whitaker. Amir is policy counsel with the ACLU of Southern California. Prior to joining the ACLU, Amir represented students and incarcerated youth throughout Florida and Alabama for the Southern Poverty Law Center, referred to as a civil rights and education stalwart by the Daytona Times. Amir has negotiated settlements and policy changes, improving the lives of hundreds of thousands of children. He has worked as a researcher with the UCLA Civil Rights Project and has written for Time Magazine and other publications. At the ACLU, Amir is responsible for legislation focused on education, equity, and funding. Amir has taught across multiple educational settings for more than a decade and has held teaching credentials in Florida, California, and New Jersey. He received his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Southern California, his Juris Doctorate from the University of Miami, and his bachelor's from Rutgers University, often referred to as Dr. Knucklehead, Amir was arrested at age 15 and eventually expelled from school. In 2014, Amir started Project Knucklehead to inspire vulnerable youth and help them reach their potential through education, music, and the arts programs. Welcome, Amir.
Afternoon, welcome, Ed. And I know you're a rattler, so I'm just gonna give you one of those.
You know, I said Florida so much. I hope that you would. Thank you so much for being with us. Next, we have Hamid Khan. Hamid is an organizer and coordinator with Stop LAPD Spy Coalition. The mission of the coalition is to build community-based power to dismantle police, surveillance, spying, and infiltration programs. The coalition utilizes multiple campaigns to advance an innovative organizing model that is Los Angeles based, but has implications regionally, nationally, and internationally. Hamid also serves on the board of May 1st Technology, a membership organization that engages in building movements by advancing the strategic use and collective control of technology for local struggles, global transformation, and emancipation without borders. Absolutely fantastic. Welcome, Hamid.
Trying to find the unmute button. Thank you so much. Happy to be here, and what a pleasure. Thank you.
Of course. To begin, we'd love if y'all could share a bit about the work you've done in energy, environmental, and housing and racial justice movements. Hamid, to you first.
Definitely. Thank you very much again, and thanks for the land acknowledgements and the moment of silence. Greetings from what is now called Long Beach in Southern California, and also on native land, on stolen land, on looted land. And I think that's what maybe brings me to your question, Ed, that any of the work, any of the organizing, any of the knowledge building, any of the knowledge exchange, any of the deciphering of policies and practices and tactics are very much driven through an intersectional approach, that you can't speak about environmental justice without speaking about racial justice. You can't speak about racial justice without talking about gender justice. You can't talk about gender justice without talking about, just dismantling borders. So it is with that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition walks into or enters the space around organizing as well. Well, some of the things that what brought the coalition together, just very briefly, my own background. I was born and raised in Pakistan. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US in the late 1970s. Very, very much sort of grew up that first generation in that post-colonial, post-partition India with the awareness of what the colonizers had done to that land, how that land was looted and pillaged. And what we are seeing the consequences, and then similarly coming to the United States and few things immediately. One, debunking the propaganda that we grew up with the USIS, which is the United States International Propaganda Agency that the CIA runs in various parts of the world. And then and also the Hollywoodization of that propaganda as well, particularly how the native communities were portrayed by Hollywood growing up in Pakistan in that old black and white television that we would see these shows and the way we were bombarded, how constantly we ourselves and what was going on with the black community in the United States. But one thing was also very clear landing on these shores or coming to the United States, that you're immediately made aware of your otherness, that that whole compartmentalization of your existence is immediately thrown at you. And especially coming from a part of the world that's either extremely exoticized with the Himalayan grandeur and Gandhian philosophy, or demonized, like, everybody's a wife burner or everybody's like a terrorist. So in that, you locate yourself and start building with communities who've had the experience. So I think for myself, I've been a student more than anything else. I've been tutored and guided, particularly based out of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles at Los Angeles Community Action Network. And if folks have been to Skid Row, been there over the last almost a dozen years, it's a mass of humanity. Our communities, our families, our relatives are folks who have been just rendered disposable or undesirable. And I think that's where the land and policing piece comes in, to be extremely made aware that, number one, in the context of surveillance, that these tactics and programs, that what does crime prevention through environmental design even mean? Right. So, and this is actually programs. And then you start looking into these things and you start realizing that, well, why the heck in South Central Los Angeles on the east side in Skid Row, you don't find any green spaces, or at least green spaces that you would see, that all you got to do is go west on 3rd Street and you go past, Western or so, and all of a sudden it's this leafy, nice neighborhoods, green spaces, everything going on. You come east and you go south, and it's all pavement, where you start realizing that that surveillance, obviously, which is a tip of the policing knife, requires that 360-degree panopticon effect. So what do? Number one, not only proliferation of liquor stores, but going back into the histories of how, the introduction of liquor and the history that at least I've learned from elders as well, and comrades in the indigenous community, in the Black community as well, but also just the removal of any green spaces. So that's what you start understanding. So then that's when, and I'll end by saying this, that one of the primary reasons why the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in my last 35 plus years of organizing came into existence about a decade ago was that we were realizing that how counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics were being rapidly incorporated into domestic policing. Predictive policing has its origins in Iraq and Afghanistan. All the electronic equipment that we hear about, Stingray and license plate readers and trap wire and high definition cameras and this, that, and the other are developed by the U.S. Marine Corps and Navy. So there's also, then we have to look at it, that if these were the tactics, counterinsurgency tactics, then who is the insurgent here domestically? So of course, it's the same communities which have been impacted historically and traditionally. We see that happening. So from the very beginning, the coalition sort of challenged this narrative that has always been there around surveillance, that which really narrows our understanding as well, that it's an invasion of privacy. Yes, it's invasion of privacy, but we have to really take it beyond that. And understanding that surveillance is that tip of the knife, that how race, poverty, and suspect bodies are policed, how land is policed through that white gaze as to who's in, who's out, who has access to land or not. So real quickly, I'll show something that how it will give you one example, and this is just one small example of looking at Skid Row. That this is what we did. We went back to LAPD, and this is Skid Row. This is where we are located on Gladys and 6th. So we asked them about 2 different 6-month periods of predictive policing hotspots. And I'm happy to report that in April of 2019 and then in April of 2020, we were able to, through that community power, completely dismantle LAPD's predictive policing programs. So they had to shut down these programs. But what we are seeing is these hotspots that predictive policing used, but you don't see them very much in Skid Row, which is the most policed area in the world. But what these are, that this is the quarantining of Skid Row. This is exactly like how policing happens, where a digital wall and a digital boundary is created, that if anybody from Skid Row even attempts to go into the new downtown, where all the gentrification and lofts are being created, you're thrown against the wall and you're bumping. So in essence, the point I'm trying to make is that on the face of it, this claim of public safety is really serving a much bigger interest of land development, of bigger interest of land speculation, and bigger interest of gentrification. So how we think of surveillance and how do we decipher it and how do we build that power becomes really critical, that it's not just an invasion of privacy, it is the intent to cause harm. It is the intent to cause harm, which leads to mass displacement and banishment of communities. And I'll to speak a little bit more about it, about South Central and other areas and the LA River, that how that's being impacted, but I'll stop there right now.
Thank you so much. How about you, Amir? Could you share a bit about the work you've done in energy, environmental, housing, and racial justice movements?
Absolutely, and thank you, Brother Hamid, for that. And I think it was through LA Can that I saw Skid Row, the cost of policing was upwards of over $1 billion over a few years. And just, imagine tens of thousands of unhoused people, right? Imagine what services would look like with that kind of investment, right? And that's what the conversation is about. My entry into this work, came as an adolescent, just in the system. And I didn't realize it until later in life and graduate school and different things where I was able to look back at it. But, some of my earliest memories are visiting parents who were incarcerated or different interactions with police, multiple drug raids before I was even out of my before I was a teenager and then throughout my teens. I consider myself a veteran of the war on drugs, and that's a war that has taken lots of my friends. I mean, arguably, even recently passed rappers or people who die of drugs, DMX and others, right? It's related to the war on drugs and the criminalization of certain drugs instead of prioritization of treatment. But I saw very early on that just something within the system seemed off, and later learned through grad school where I was just so confused that I just said, all right, well, go to law school and try to still figure out what's going on, because I didn't understand how the system was working. If, buying into that American fairy tale that they tell us, right, about, and I loved how Brother Hamid described like the Hollywoodization of, narratives of different cultures, of different people, but there's definitely this, thing that we're sold as Americans about the struggle and the true story. And my story in my life didn't fit in with that, when, for example, when I was in law school, both of my brothers were incarcerated, right? So I'm studying one side of the law, but the reality is both of my brothers, my family, are on the other side of the law. And we're reading the law as if it's, accepted on face value and treats everyone equally, as opposed to understanding the law is actually a tool that has been used to oppress communities for a long time, right? And then enforcement of the law is what really, or how the law is, both enforcement of the law and how the law is enforced is something that really terrorizes communities, right? If we look at the numbers with over 10 million Americans being arrested every year, that's through police in the communities, and some communities rounding people up and really treating communities like an occupying army, the police, because I have early memories, 11 years old, 12 years old, what's now known as stop and frisk, right? And ACLU has fought that in different places, but I just thought it was a rite of passage when, when you walk a certain way, I was criminalized before I even thought of myself as a criminal. The first gun that was ever pointed in my face from police officers and different things like that. So those kind of experiences frame my life. And as was mentioned, I started a nonprofit actually in Florida and called Project Knucklehead while working in the juvenile courthouse there. Because I was working in Miami where they had this scandal breakout literally called Fight Club. I encourage you to Google it. It's one of the most unbelievable things. But the facilities in Miami were so bad that the youth facilities, the youth prisons, youth jails were so bad that the guards themselves were basically running a fight club with the youth, who were so bored, right, that they were fighting because they had nothing else to do. And while in Florida, I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we sued several juvenile facilities because of their treatment of youth and their lack of treatment of youth, where they weren't providing any services or programming, despite these private corporations. In Florida, it's all privatized, so multi-million-dollar, corporations, G4S and such, receiving these monies, our tax dollars, to traumatize our youth, to perpetuate slavery with our youth. And in Florida, where it was so bad that the youth were fighting because they had, well, one, because the adults supervising them were encouraging violence. And these institutions are violent themselves, right? Policing itself is a violent institution. And that's why many people are pushing for things beyond it, because you can never solve, you can never create peace with violence, right? And you can never solve society's issues with the threat of violence. But in Miami, we started Project Knucklehead there just to give the youth something else to do aside from fight, right? And saw it in the system. And we have our mantra called, it's free the youth. And when we say that with Project Knucklehead, it's, we mean freedom of expression, because that's what we gave them. We brought the arts and music and different things into the facilities. It's for freedom of expression, but it's also just freedom from the cages, right? Because many developed nations, most nations don't treat their children like we treat our children, or adults as well, right? So that's how I entered the work. And I came to ACLU SoCal about 3 years ago, working specifically on education work and within the context of police and schools. And I've published different reports and done work on that I can talk about a little bit as well, but just wanted to share that frame and context of how I came to the work. Thank you all for having me.
Thank y'all so much for that amazing background and some of the work y'all been doing. And thank you for doing that work. We're going to move into our Q&A. While you both work on very different aspects of policing, you both work with communities impacted by criminalized area codes and districts. Can you elaborate on your perspective and provide any personal context on the importance of decriminalizing area codes? Amir, we can start with you.
Absolutely. I have a story from one of our youth in Project Knucklehead. Some of you may know the way they measure success with people who've been incarcerated is like what they call recidivism rates, or if they avoid future contact with law enforcement. Well, we have this one youth who was one of our star youth. We invested so much in him. We got his own piano and different things, supported him with education, and just he was really taking it on. And for 2 years we worked with him, right? But then he got rearrested. And according to the way we measure success in grants or in general, we failed that youth. But why was he rearrested? Well, he was unhoused and he was in a park and he was arrested. And this was in Florida where they could do that. Here in California, they can't do that as much, and they can't criminalize. They still find ways to criminalize poverty, but they at least can't do that, right? But he was arrested for being in the park. And what is that? That's the criminalization of an area, right? Creating him as an other in his own community. And I always think of what is now known as Hawaii, where I visited, because less than 100 years ago, Hawaii was indigenous land owned, and their policy there before the colonizers, before policing, was people had a right to be anywhere. You have a right to be places. So the idea that our bodies can be illegal in a space is something that came from policing, and this notion, and we know policing is rooted in the criminalization of Black bodies or the taking of indigenous lands anyway. So it's very much by its foundation focused on criminalizing places and people, but not all equally, as we know.
Yes. Hamid, can you elaborate on your perspective and provide any personal context on the importance of decriminalizing area codes and districts?
Yeah, and I can give example of our own work of the Stop LAPD Spine Coalition housed at LA Can and Skid Row. That decriminalizing area codes and land has to be done by people who are living in that land and who are directly impacted and who are seeing this thing day in and day out. So from the very beginning, one of the ways that the coalition, I mean, its guiding values has been that, number one, that what we are fighting back is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. That this notion of surveillance didn't start with the FBI, it didn't start with COINTELPRO, it didn't start with Edward Snowden's revelation, didn't start after 9/11. You know, I mean, we can go back centuries, and even in the United States, at least, you know, going back to lantern laws, for example. And I know that Professor Simone Brown has done some amazing work, particularly their book Dark Matters, which investigates surveillance during the time of slavery. You know, so in a sense, where lantern laws going back to early 1700s in New York City, where a person, if you were an enslaved body and you were out there in public walking without your master, that you had to walk with a lantern in your hand. So basically self-identifying yourself as a threat to the system. So you know, I mean, and we've seen various sort of forms of how it has manifested in so many ways, like right now, electronic monitor and ankle bracelets that people walk around with, almost like self-identifying themselves, whether you're an undocumented immigrant or you're on parole or you're out there. So these markings have always been there. So for us, it was really critical that how does the community get involved and take ownership and really, you know, debunk a lot of these things as well, where we know that this is about the intent to cause harm. So for us, you know, in Skid Row, the fight that we had around predictive policing, which was almost a 7-year fight, was really kind of completely reconfiguring the language, reconfiguring the vocabulary, that how are people, and of course, there are certain things when you speak about an algorithm where you can only speak about an algorithm in so many different ways. But what does that algorithm mean? How is this language of AI and machine learning and risk assessment is really glossing over, we also call it the sensationalism behind it, that how it's masking the same old impact that has always been there with this veneer of science, that how this pseudoscience is now being thrown at us, that, well, the computers are race neutral. No, they're not, because I think so building that power where folks were deciding that, no, you can't reform this thing. This is a diseased, toxic body. Then the only way is to abolish this thing. And in that journey of abolition, you know, how do we starve the beast? What is that? So that's where I guess the defund piece comes in as well. Then how do you start removing these resources? And today, actually, as we speak right now in the Los Angeles Police Commission, and a lot of my comrades are busy with that, you know, there is a proposal from the LAPD, which is basically asking for $67 million more to reform itself, where they want to spend $700,000 just on practice bullets, that each one of their 9,000 individuals would get 70 bullets to practice before they go out on protest, where they want to spend millions of dollars to create a special bureau, where now they are reconfiguring the whole term around infiltrators and undercovers to shadow teams. So it is through the zip code and people who are living there, like, you know, just kind of just unpacking this, deciphering this, but also down to, you know, how did we even file for public records? Because we have very successfully weaponized them. That the public records, and with all respect to the lawyers, that we never got lawyers involved in this thing. That for us, filing for public records was helping build a story. So the community, I mean, we would have people every Tuesday we meet. Now we are doing it over Zoom because of COVID, but people would come, literally sometimes people would come out of their tents. Sometimes people were in their resident hotels and all of that. And we would come together and start breaking it down, like, you know, okay, what do you want to tell? So people would say, I want to know what they were thinking. I want to know what sort of outcome are they expecting. I want to know what kind of staffing is there. I want to know where the money is coming from. So in essence, to decriminalize the neighborhood, in essence, to decriminalize the area code, first of all, we have to, through the experiences of the community, understand that what is that criminalization that is happening? What are the tools that are being deployed? What is the narrative and Skid Row being ravaged as a result of broken windows policing that was launched in 2005 with Safer Cities Initiative? We had seen that impact, that within the first 2 years, over 30,000 citations were issued for just jaywalking or urinating in public. Well, where else are people going to go for 5,000 people? There's not even a single bathroom. There are not even trash cans over there. right? So in a sense, this is where the intersectional piece comes in, that it was the same process, the same tactics that LAPD was using that ICE uses, and that were proposed in, for example, SB 1070 in Arizona, where the central piece was attrition through enforcement, that you deploy the municipal codes to the maximum and throw the book at people and make people's lives miserable, that they almost self-deport themselves, that they almost self-leave. So I think in that sort of an overview, it was really critical to see, and ultimately what interest was it serving? Gentrification, more land development, more lofts, more doggy motels, or whatever you want to call them, and things like that. So I think that's the process that we've been engaged in decriminalizing area codes.
An amazing point, Hamid, and picking up on it. Can you elaborate on the abolitionist perspective in addressing police violence versus the reformist perspective on that matter? In other words, do you think it's possible for decriminalization to truly take place under our current system of government?
Absolutely, it can. I mean, obviously, but I think I say that with a lot of conviction, but I also caution myself that you can't rush through that. I mean, in a sense, like, the revolution is not going to be funded. So first of all, we have to be very cautious about the role of, even within our movements as well, that what are some of the barriers? It has to be, from our vantage point, abolition, the first step towards abolition is a whole lot of unlearning. It's a whole lot of shedding that baggage that we have grown up with, where within the white supremacist, patriarchal, settler colonial capitalist system, that, well, the system works. All you got to do is that it moves at a glacial pace. And it's like a big old ship. So all of these analyses that are given to us, but believe in that. But here I'm going to bring in my dear comrade General Dogon, who's an amazing human rights defender at LA Can and in Skid Row. That him and we always talk about that, how the Constitution itself is a blueprint for oppression, and I think that's what Amir kind of just raised that earlier as well. So we're not seeking any remedies around, through legislative actions or through litigation. Yes, I mean, we need to be creative with that, like we even file for public records, but to what ends? So I think, first of all, it's really critical that we completely shun the idea that this can be reformed. And here, I mean, nothing personal. We've actually spoken out, myself and Pete White, who's the ED of LA Can, wrote an op-ed against ACLU's community control over police surveillance proposals, because we feel that, that is absolutely going to prolong the pain, and that was also maybe leads to creating more surveillance bureaucracies, the CCOPS model, by creating these ordinances. So the thing is that rather than seeking just reform, and so it's really about how are we building that power, how are we unpacking what remains on the front of it, and what does it mean in the long run? And I'll show you one quick example here that why it is necessary, that reform is not going to change it. That here is the same thing that I was sharing with you. Here is what we have mapped out in South Central Los Angeles. This is LAPD's predictive policing program, Operation Laser. But when you think of it, when you look at it now, the yellow is all like where the shot spotters are, so how the sound echoes, that how they have criminalized blocks by blocks and blocks of neighborhood that they're talking about crime, but yet at the same time, in that crime, the whole community is being demonized. Right? That even Operation Laser, the Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program, the argument was that the people who created this, and this is where the academic complicity comes in as well, that they called it laser because Professor Craig Uchida, Dr. Craig Uchida, said that we want to go into these neighborhoods with laser-like precisions to remove tumors from the community. So now they're calling people as tumors, but in the meantime, all of this, so many square miles has been demonized and rendered as a diseased land, if you will. And this is where they kind of map it out. So what does it do? And of course, for lawyers, I guess the Indiana case and all of that from Supreme Court, that when you deem an area as a high threat area, it provides even more immunity to law enforcement to use lethal use of force. So, so now you have demonized this land, people go in, they're all charged up, and this is why we released a report titled Before the Bullet Hits the Body on predictive policing, that what are the conditions on the ground? And in that conditioning is what is happening is that there's this story that the whole neighborhood is being criminalized, is being created. So let's go and police this neighborhood. Let's use the full force of helicopters and drones and surveillance, and let's go in with guns blazing. So in a sense, can you reform this? Because when the thinking and the narratives and the tactics are rooted in counterinsurgency, so the insurgent remains the same Black, brown, immigrant, indigenous body. So our fight is only to abolish and to dismantle not just that thinking, but also the systems. I mean, not just the systems, but also the thinking behind it too. And you just can't reform it. So that's the argument that we have, that why reform doesn't work, and why creating more bureaucracy, and why giving them more resources, and why this whole facade of transparency and accountability. Really, at the end of the day, we've seen this thing, again and again and again, right now, since not even going back too far in history, after the Watts uprising, after Rodney King uprising, after the May Day melee, after the Democratic Convention, after Ferguson. It's the same cycle about reform that keeps on haunting us.
Thank you so much. I mean, incredibly powerful. Amir, tagging you in, what are your thoughts? Can you elaborate on the abolitionist perspective in addressing police violence versus the reformist perspective on that matter? And do you think it's possible for decriminalization to truly take place under our current system of government?
Right. Yeah. And thank you, Hamid, for calling that, because organizations like the ACLU have not traditionally been, the abolitionist organizations, right? And have sometimes been barriers. So definitely acknowledging that and sharing that. I was an abolitionist before I came to ACLU, and I'll be one after, right? But the question of whether the system can be reformed, right? We see 1,000 people are still murdered every year, despite, body cameras, despite bans on chokeholds, despite these different reforms that come after, different things. So I think that speaks for itself, right? It's not necessarily working. I do want to share a resource, and I'll drop the link in the chat as well, but I'll do a quick screen share of it as well, because a lot of work has been done on this reform versus abolition stuff, because there's, as you all see, right, there are different policy proposals that will be proposed, that have been coming. But this is something from Critical Resistance, which, abolitionist organization that have lots of educational materials. And they ask, for really important questions. Does this reduce funding to the police, right? Which, as we shared today, literally a proposal in LA right now, right, is for more funding for police. Does it challenge the notion that police increase safety? Because that's the myth that Hamid talked about, right? We have to challenge that notion. Does it reduce the tools, tactics, and technology that police have at their disposal? And does it reduce the scale of policing? So those are 4 of the questions they ask. They provide for the framework, and they go through different areas and provide different examples of, policies like body cameras, for example, right? Body cameras are not an abolitionist tool. They're a reformist tool, and they cost more money and different things. So, I would say check out that link and understand, it's a full spectrum, right? But also the political landscape we're in, right? Because abolition, I think of the election of 2016, right, where both of the presidential candidates, neither of them wanted to even say defund the police. And for some people, just defunding is, it's a tool of abolition, but there are some abolitionist folks who are saying, like, defund itself is not enough. And there are lots of people who would agree with defund, but would not agree with abolition, right? So, but we have, the president of the United States and the vice president, who's a law enforcement officer. Neither of them really support defunding the police in itself, right? So that goes to show we're not even at abolition, but just defunding. And here in California, unfortunately, we had a bill, or we have a bill for education reform, or we want to remove the mandatory contact that teachers and administrators have to do with law enforcement. Basically, all the times the educators have to call police. we want to dismantle that system, because part of the problem, roadblocks to abolition, are the mandatory, the way policing is ingrained in every day, right? Like, even if you get into a car accident, who do you call to get an insurance report, right? And just different things, you kind of have to call the police sometimes, or you have to call 911. And our bill to just reduce that was delayed because, you know, of some educators and their reservations on it. So, and that's not even, it's not even an abolitionist bill. It's just for some reform and flexibility. So there's a full spectrum, you know, from defund to abolition, and you know, there's lots of things, but it's really important to know that lots of reforms embed and ingrain policing in the system even more, and we need to be cautious of those reforms.
One real quick thing, Ed, if I could share as well, like I think it's also, and absolutely, you know, just building on Amir's point, that I think in looking at the scale of this apparatus also kind of should give us a pause as well. I mean, for example, I just want to share an example of this project that we are working on in mapping out the stalker state, and how what are the intricacies of this stalker state as well. So look at this. This is like a static Venn diagram, but if you look at it, that this, I mean, and we are in the process of creating a digital model of this thing as well, by digital visualization, that how constantly information is moving within the public sector, private sector, law enforcement, corporations. So even when, you know, when we think of, and there are groups who do talk about that, you know, that you can have an unbiased algorithm. Well, you know, mathematically speaking, that, you know, it is so difficult because our bodies, our whole being has been sort of like, you know, the datification of our bodies is so vast that we have become these molecular beings in this ether space, that each one of that piece is up for pickings. Each one of them, whether it's for Google, whether it's for Facebook, whether it's for somebody who sells tennis shoes, or people, or the restaurants, or movies. And I'm just talking about, you know, our day-to-day living. Right? So in a sense that, you know, so where is our fight? And even around the data as well, that, you know, when we talk about abolition, we also have to seriously start thinking about the data abolition as well, that how much more data do we need? Because, you know, I mean, it becomes really exhausting to constantly show the disparate impact. Like, you know, 5 times Black people are being stopped in South Central Los Angeles versus, I mean, that is a story that goes on and on and on and on. Like, you know, as Amir was saying, that, you know, every 7 hours and 42 minutes, somebody's murdered. When you do about 1,100 killings a year and do the math by 24 hours a day in 365 days, that should give us a pause as well. So I think I just wanted to throw that in our journey towards abolition, which is very much a multi-generational journey, and it is a journey, but I think how are we at least staying where we are in this generation, that no, we will continue to fight, we'll continue to come after you, and our only goal is to abolish you, because we know that this is a toxic system, and the poison, you can't remove it, because whether you reduce the poison, it's still a poison, and it's slow death as well. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. I'm sure your answers were not surprising to the folks on this call. A quick reminder that if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat for an audience Q&A towards the end of the program. And I know this may seem a little obvious to some of us here, but to Amir, to you first, what interconnections have you seen between housing injustice, environmental racism, and policing?
Oh, absolutely. They're all interconnected. You know, as police are the agents of the state, right? And our state does not love the earth, does not respect the land, does not respect a lot of things. I mean, just this Friday, my organization, Project Knucklehead, we're organizing a march for the earth in South LA, in Leimert Park, South Central LA, where, you know, it's one of the historically Black areas. And there's this park, it's literally named after it, Leimert Park, but it's been closed as long as I've been back in LA, which has been 4 years, you know, because it's been criminalized, and it's the only green space in the area, right? And LA is a concrete jungle, and it's like, it hurts my soul how much of a concrete jungle this is. But as a resident of South Central LA, you know, Leimert Park is like one of the closest parks to me. but it's been closed ever since they say about 2012 or 2011 when Hillary Clinton had like a rally or something in the area. So the police came and shut it off. And they've kind of used that as an excuse to keep it closed since then. But we know, broken window policing, and we know the impact of having green space, right? It can actually reduce crime. We know trees, and we know that. We have the research. Yet, one of the only places, green spaces in the concrete jungle is shut down in South Central LA. And the police regulate that, right? The city imposes it, and then the police regulate it. So, we're marching this Friday against that very issue.
Yes, Amir, please drop those links and let us know. Hamid, to you, what interconnections have you seen between housing injustice, environmental racism, and policing?
Well, I mean, and I know I keep on showing these pictures. I'll give you one example of that. So this is the LA River. This is the development of LA River. Like, we're seeing a whole lot of hoopla about the LA River. But as this development is happening, look at some of these things, that how these areas are being criminalized. They're being deemed as laser zone for high policing. So this is where the LA River is. So this is Highland Park, and this is Figueroa going up there, and this goes into Pasadena. So, and we know that that one of the main purposes that who has their eyes on LA River? It's the developers, it's the land grabbers, it's the land speculators. That is going to be a desired landscape for people to build their McMansions and everything else. So what do? Well, let's try to demonize this land, and it's nothing new. It's, again, like I was saying, not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. Just as similarly, gang injunctions were being imposed in LA starting in the early 1980s, and neighborhoods were being criminalized as a result. And what was going on, we saw that in Echo Park, we saw that in Silver Lake, we saw that in a lot of these gentrified neighborhoods, that how, first of all, they would be deemed as these crime-ridden, drug peddling, prostitution, the classic broken window story that George Kelly and James Q. Wilson came out with, right? So in a sense, this is how we look at it, that policing land, and this is what land and policing really comes down to. And we're going to be releasing a report towards the end of June on this piece as well, that while a lot of focus has been spent on broken windows policing, but still, and we saw that one example of Breonna Taylor's murder, that how it was really land speculation, it was a real estate interest that was really guiding that area and the policing of that area. So the undesirables had to be removed and banished and then murdered, and that's where before the bullet hits the body. So now these are the conditions before the bullet hits the body that are being set up and established to criminalize the land. And of course, what does it mean? I mean, it's not about policing potholes, it's about what is on that land. So now in criminalizing the land, what will happen? Let's start clear cutting. Let's start creating that crime prevention through environmental design. So what areas? Then let's start looking at people who may be unhoused, there may be an encampment, because encampments and unhoused people are eyesores. That's what we saw in that major policing of and removal of encampments of people in Echo Park just about 3 weeks ago. So in a sense, to your question, I think that's what I was saying, that as we unpack these things, it is incumbent upon us, particularly, that how are we decolonizing all this knowledge? Because as holders of knowledge, and once we file these public records, it is our duty to really kind of try to bring it down to the ground level, that all of us together, and how do we then popularize this thing? What is our outreach? What is the language that we are creating? What is our popular education about these things? Because so people can relate to it, and that's where the fight comes in, that it is really in our own hands and the community's hand to really to build that journey towards abolition in the long run. But the first thing is to really knowing our fight, about what is our fight.
Wow, it's not about policing potholes. Incredibly powerful. Since the start of the pandemic last year in March, we've seen critical responses to police violence across America, particularly with the murder of George Floyd. This particular situation is not new, nor does it give us any sign of letting up under our current systems of policing and government. What we have seen, however, is a rise of protest, of building critical knowledge and coalition, and of demanding accountability. That said, Amir, to you first, how has your work been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the uprisings we've seen since March 2020? And how have any new initiatives sprung up in response to what we've seen this past year?
Absolutely. Great question for both of them. You know, it's been good and bad. There's opportunities, you know, in change. But with the, you know, as a person who primarily works with young people in education settings, you know, their education now is happening digitally, 100% virtual learning, which means the schools are in their house, which means surveillance is in their house sometimes too. So, you know, youth have devices. We've heard stories with students complaining about teachers turning their camera on at random times when they're, you know, maybe having a conversation with their sister or something. The teacher's unmuting their computer. We had one student who was playing a video game on a device that the school provided, you know, because his parents paid for it with their tax dollars. The police came to his house over him playing a video game. How is that a crime? What does a police officer have to do with it, right? So these were problems we didn't have before COVID. So yeah, you know, we have all sorts of stories with surveillance, and shout out to my colleague Ana Mendoza who's on the front line handling that stuff. And as you said, you know, with the murder of George Floyd, there has been historic uprisings and protests, which contributed to that decision we heard last week, right? We know we've seen these stories before, and if literally over 100 countries didn't protest and daily protests didn't happen, we probably wouldn't have had some accountability for the officers last week. But it's helped. So that, for example, here in LA, LAUSD, the Los Angeles Unified School District, passed the community forced the school district to defund the police by $25 million and reinvest that money into counselors, social workers. They actually reduced the force by over 100 police officers and hired the equivalent in social workers. And before that, you know, as someone who has been working on that issue here in LA for years, for example, we couldn't even get the teachers union to support it, you know, less than a year ago. The teachers union was a barrier to it. And actually what I shared earlier about our bill at the state level to reduce police contact, the teachers union essentially did that as well. So the teachers union, a historic barrier to removing police from school after the murder of George Floyd, came more in support, both in LA and also in Oakland, where they were able to completely remove the police. In Oakland, they did something radical and revolutionary where I think they're even melting the guns that the police used to have and the cars that the police used to drive. Now the school educators and staff have those cars to check on students and do things, you know. So that's such a beautiful and revolutionary thing that may have not happened so fast without the uprisings.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Amir. The way the system tries to put cameras into our homes never astonishes me. Honestly, never astonishes me. And Hamid, how has your work been affected by COVID-19 and the uprisings we've seen since March 2020? Have you had any new initiatives spring up in response to what we've seen this past year?
Yes, it's. I mean, it has its impact on many different levels. I mean, I think both the challenges that we have faced, because as organizers, I mean, many of us are still old school organizers. We believe in door knocking. We believe in that personal contact. We believe in very much being out in the street. And I mean, we would all carry these old butcher papers in our backpack and draw out the architecture of surveillance and put it out there on the street and just start talking to people. So because for us, it's about collective learning and building that collective knowledge and to be informed and guided by how people are thinking of surveillance as well. And that's basically what the coalition did for the first 8 to 9 months, to spend time with youth coming out of cages, at YJC members, Youth Justice Coalition members, with Gender Justice LA, that how queer trans folks were thinking of surveillance, with undocumented immigrants, for folks in Skid Row. So in a sense, for us to even understand that what is that perception. So I think and that which led to that we would meet every Tuesday at LA Can, without fail, to strategize, to think about our campaigns and different fights that we have against the drones, against body cameras, around suspicious activity reporting, around predictive policing, and the whole infrastructure of surveillance as well. But then we had to pivot. We had to really be nimble, and we switched to Zoom. I mean, we looked at Mumble, we looked at other platforms as well, but they were not giving us, so we had to shift to this digital organizing. But as a result, that both, while it has limited at times our capacity, because many of our folks in Skid Row don't have access to computers, don't have access to that technology, so people have to go to libraries and things like that. But yet at the same time, the footprint expanded as well. The bandwidth expanded, because we had people coming in from all over the world. Today, for example, is our 55th webinar, like 55th Tuesday since March 24th of 2020 that we are having our webinar today. So every week, and it's also sort of like, themed as well. So looking at the intersection of gender and sexuality, the first Tuesday of the month, and surveillance, looking at the war on youth. And Amir would love to talk to you about that as well. And the National Security Police State, looking at data-driven policing. So, but to your question about the uprisings, I mean, this is the largest social movement, at least that I know of, and having been involved in against military dictatorship and student organizing in Pakistan and all of that. I mean, these are massive, but this is huge. This is a global social movement that happened. And I think one of the key pieces was that while, yes, absolutely, Black Lives Matter, it's an incredible movement that's very much leading the charge. But yet what we saw being out on the street on May 28th, May 30th, that, how the shift was taking place as well. How young people were really leading the charge, and almost like this classic leaderless kind of movement was in motion. And that was one thing. And second thing was that how they even expected, because law enforcement, we couldn't control it. Well, no, this was different. This was not just south of the 10 and east of Crenshaw and west of Alameda, or so north of the 405. This crossed the 10. This went into the Lily White, Fairfax district, and all of these, upper class kind of neighborhoods. So disruption was happening right there in people's face. So I think that's the discomfort, the disruption, and in a way flipping the script on COINTELPRO, that how do we neutralize, how do we discredit, how do we disrupt? And I think these are the things that are emerging out of this movement building as well. And what is our role, both individually and collectively, of organizations in this? I think that's the roles that we all have to play.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to move into our audience Q&A. I know we're running towards the end on time. If you have any questions, please keep dropping them in the chat or raise your hand. Our first question is on filming the police. If y'all could just give your thoughts on that. Your thoughts on filming the police when they're doing their jobs. We saw in light of the George Floyd trial how important that was, that there was constant rolling footage. Amir, to you first on this.
Absolutely. And ACLU, we have an app called Mobile Justice where you can download in any state, which, I'm sure New Hampshire has their version too, right? We have our California version, because it also has Know Your Rights info, specifically that, about your rights, because as citizens, we have the right to film the police. But the app has a feature that allows you to send the video directly to us, or to ensure to back it up in a way that if the police can't delete it. So highly encourage you to film the police when needed, but don't use it as something to agitate them, right? Don't sing "fuck the police" while you're filming the police or anything like that. Highly discourage that sort of behavior.
Hamid, how about you?
Absolutely, very much encouraged. And actually we do, and talking about General Dogon, who's got like multiple PhDs on Cop Watch, and how we do that. And the coalition has also, and we have both of those videos on our website, like Watch the Watchers, They Lie. I think, but there's one thing about filming, but it's also got to be critical that how are you filming it? And to Amir's point, that that it has to be done. There's a whole sort of method to this madness that the person who's filming and has the camera needs to know that don't self-implicate yourself, and because this can be pulled in or subpoenaed anytime. So in a sense, what are those teams and what kind of trainings are people going through? That who's taking the notes, who's watching your back? So when we do watch the watchers on rallies and marches, it's like different teams of 3 from different angles who just put the camera on there. And the goal being that sometimes, like even now, and I think just this Sunday, there was a march at Pan Pacific Park and a rally, and we saw somebody using a drone. And there was nobody in the rally that we knew who were using a drone. But then we also have to be cautious that how this footage, both in the see something, say something realm, how it's going to be again than what LAPD did last year, that they pulled up, them and the FBI pulled up all the footage from CCTVs from businesses, and then they started going after people and started putting charges for looting and things like that. So filming is absolutely critical, but how it's done is also an important point as well.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I was just wondering if could I follow up on that a little bit?
Please, Brett.
So this mostly derives from watching the George Floyd video, especially the early parts where essentially the police waved off one of the filmers. Like they just used the threat of being a policeman to make the first filmer go away. And it really, really struck me in that the police account of what happened was so out of line with the video. Like that became apparent later. And it only became apparent because of the persistence of that second filmer. The second person that was filming was persistent and stayed on it essentially and kept filming. And I was just wondering if thinking more systemically, whether it makes sense to push for laws that essentially criminalize the police waving off somebody like that, saying like, you can't film us. Like I realize the First Amendment protects a lot of that filming, but in the actual like interplay on the street, it doesn't matter much if the police can use their authority to kind of just make the filmer go away.
Amir,
and they shouldn't, and whether that itself should be criminalized. Having the police like use their authority to make the filming go away.
Right. I mean, police aren't accountable for their behavior. That's part of the problem. And yes, they abuse their power. They lie to people. And that person, in their persistence, knowing their right to still film the police, despite the police saying that they didn't have the right or trying to discourage them, is what saved and what started this whole uprising, right? Because if we didn't have that video, we wouldn't have it. So yeah, police need to be held accountable for all of their behavior. We have a bill now, we're co-sponsoring with Youth Justice Coalition and other organizations to just create a process to decertify police. Qualified immunity. They're kind of immune from anything, but definitely when they violate the civil rights of a person, violate the free speech of a person, we should find, until we eliminate the profession completely, we should find a way to hold them accountable when they violate our rights, because they're supposed to be there to protect us, or at least they tell us that, right? But we know that's not what they actually are there to do, but they at least shouldn't be the ones violating our rights.
Ahmed, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, and just building on Amir's point, like, that it's not just the moment of filming, but what happens afterwards as well. And obviously we've seen the trauma from the young person who filmed George Floyd's murder. But I also want to incredible credit to that, and I'm forgetting their name right now, that they were so conscientious that the camera just stayed right there, that they were not going around and you kind of just who's watching, who's not. That no, I have my eye on you, and that's exactly the classic form of filming. But also just the emotional trauma that they went through, but also the harassment of forgetting the names of the person who filmed Eric Garner's murder. That whole famous video as well, and then also the person who did Walter Scott in North Carolina, I believe, or South Carolina. So I think these are the examples as well that we learned from that too, where they had to really think very seriously that if they should release that video for 3 or 4 days because of the fear factor, because of just and they know that these are violent institutions. then won't only just body up or threaten you or intimidate you in the moment. That intimidation will continue later on and afterwards as well. But it's because of that courage, and it's because of that just doing the right thing and conscientiousness that that we are now even having these conversations.
Thank you so much, Brett, for your question. Any more from the audience? Any more questions for our panelists? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your time. I've had so much I have so much fun being with you all here today. I'll throw it back to you, Yolanda.
Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible knowledge. The chat is full of links and resources and things to check out afterwards. We'll be sure to send maybe a rap sheet of that after the event, just so that everyone has some of that. Our interns will also be putting together a resource guide post the series overall, just so that people who want to learn more about these different movements are able to do so with some support. And we will have our final event next week on Thursday on a toxic tour of LA's oil refineries and the impacts, the health implications of those. So feel free to come to that final event. We will have our interns, our amazing interns, kind of moderate that conversation. I'm excited to see them in their power. But yes, thank you so much for sharing this space and sharing this, the incredible knowledge that you both have brought in. You as well, Ed. Incredible energy. Thank you so much, everyone.